In the year 1989, in the quiet countryside of a small American town, there was a family that lived far from the noise and busy streets. The Johnson family had a small white farmhouse surrounded by green fields, tall trees, and a narrow dirt road that curved its way to the main street several miles away. Their land seemed peaceful, a place where the world felt gentle and calm. Everyone in town knew the Johnsons as hardworking and kind, though they mostly kept to themselves, focusing on farm life and each other. The Johnson children were 5 in number, ranging from little Lily, who was just 3 years old and loved following her older siblings everywhere, to Emily, who at 12 felt almost like a second mother to the others. In between were Matthew, age 10, who loved drawing pictures of the animals on the farm. Twins. Jacob and Jenny, age 7, who always seemed to be giggling or chasing after the family's brown dog, Rusty. Together, they made the house feel full of laughter and busy footsteps. Their parents, Martha and George, worked long hours caring for their land and animals. Life was not always easy, but there was a warmth in their home that made it special. Every evening, after supper, Martha would gather the children in the cozy living room where they would sit near the wood stove and listen to her read old storybooks. Sometimes George would play the harmonica and the kids would try to dance, even though they often stumbled and ended up laughing in a heap on the rug. The days might be filled with chores, schoolwork, and helping around the farm, but the nights always ended with hugs and the soft singing of lullabies as Martha tucked them into bed. She would walk from room to room, smoothing hair and kissing foreheads, before switching off the lamp and whispering goodnight. On one crisp autumn night, in October, nothing seemed unusual. The sky outside sparkled with stars, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet smell of drying leaves. The Johnsons followed their routine, as always. After supper, the children brushed their teeth, changed into pajamas, and said their prayers. Made sure Lily's favorite doll was safely tucked in beside her, and Jacob and Jenny fought playfully over who would sleep closer to the window. Martha calmed them with a promise of pancakes for breakfast, and George double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, just as he did every night. With the children asleep, Martha and George sat quietly in the kitchen, sipping tea and talking about plans for the upcoming harvest festival. They spoke softly, careful not to wake the children, smiled at the thought of seeing their little ones dressed up for the celebration. When the clock struck 10, they decided to turn in for the night themselves, leaving the house still and peaceful under the watch of the moon. But the peace of that night would not last. When morning arrived, the sun crept slowly over the horizon, filling the farmhouse with golden light. Martha woke up first, as she always did, and set about making breakfast. She smiled as she poured pancake batter into the pan, thinking of the promise she made the night before. She expected to hear the usual sounds of sleepy footsteps and laughter coming down the stairs. But the house was unusually quiet. Even Rusty, the dog, was lying by the kitchen door, his head on his paws. Looking up at her with questioning eyes, Martha called up the stairs, expecting at least Emily or Matthew to answer. When she got no reply, she walked up herself, wondering if the children had decided to play a game of hide-and-seek. As she opened the door to their shared bedroom, her heart skipped a beat. The beds were empty. The covers were pulled back as if the children had gotten up in the night, but there was no sign of any of them. The twins' favorite blanket was left on the floor, and Lily's doll was still tucked in the bed, but Lily herself was gone. Confused, Martha searched the entire house, calling out the children's names. She looked in the closets, behind the curtains, even under the beds. George heard her worried voice and hurried to help. Together they searched the barn, the chicken coop, the woodshed, and all around the yard, thinking perhaps the children had gone out early to play. There was no sign of them anywhere. The family's dog barked and sniffed at the edge of the yard, but seemed just as puzzled as they were. Within the hour, the Johnsons' worry turned into fear. They ran to the nearest neighbor's house, nearly a mile down the road, hoping that children might have wandered there. The neighbors had not seen or heard anything unusual. By midday, word had spread to every corner of the small town. People arrived at the Johnson farmhouse, forming search parties and fanning out across the fields and woods. The sheriff, who had known the family for years, led the search himself, determined to find the missing children. The search continued late into the night. Flashlights cut through the darkness as townsfolk called out the children's names, hoping to hear an answer. People checked barns, sheds, and even old wells, thinking the children might be hiding or lost. Every possible explanation was considered, but none made sense. The children were not the type to run away, and there were no signs of a struggle or anything unusual in the house. Everything was just as it always was, except the children were gone. As days passed, the town was filled with worry and sadness. The Johnsons stayed at home, hoping every hour for some news, refusing to believe that their children had simply vanished. The police worked tirelessly, interviewing neighbors, following up every rumor and checking every lead, no matter how small. Some said they had seen a strange car on the road days before, while others wondered if the children had gotten lost in the woods. The town held prayer meetings and organized more searches, but the hope began to fade as each day ended. With no answers, news reporters arrived, their cameras capturing the farmhouse and the worried faces of the parents. The story spread beyond the little town, and soon people from far away were sending letters of support, hoping the children would be found safe. Martha and George found comfort in the kindness of strangers, but the pain of not knowing grew heavier. With each passing day, weeks turned into months, and slowly the search parties stopped coming. The town returned to its routines, but nothing was ever quite the same. The farmhouse, once full of laughter and life, grew quiet and lonely. Martha kept the children's room just as it was, hoping that someday the door would open and they would come running back inside. George spent hours each evening sitting on the porch, staring down the long dirt road, waiting for a sign. The disappearance of the Johnson children became a story that everyone in town remembered. People talked in hushed voices about that autumn night, wondering what could have happened. Some believed the children might still be alive somewhere waiting to be found. Others feared they would never know the truth. But one thing was certain: the mystery of the vanished children would never be forgotten. The little farmhouse in the countryside would always hold the memory of 5 children who disappeared without a trace. For months after the children's disappearance, the Johnson farmhouse changed. The place that was once filled with noise, movement, and laughter now felt empty, almost as if time had slowed down. Martha moved through the rooms in a daze, cleaning up toys that no one played with, folding clothes that never got worn, and tucking in beds that stayed untouched. George tried to keep himself busy with chores around the farm, but even feeding the animals felt like a reminder of what was missing. Sometimes he would find himself staring at the swing set in the yard, remembering the sound of the twins laughing as they pushed each other higher in the town. People spoke about the Johnsons with sympathy and confusion. It wasn't just the shock of the children vanishing that bothered them, it was the way it happened, without any sign or warning. At church, folks prayed for the family, and at the grocery store, neighbors gave Martha gentle hugs and awkward words of comfort. Still, some whispered behind closed doors, wondering if there was something about the Johnsons that hadn't come to light. It was a small town, after all, where everyone knew everyone's business, or at least they thought they did. As the first winter came and went, the case faded from headlines. Other stories took over, and fewer reporters visited the farmhouse. The sheriff continued his investigation as best as he could, but without new evidence or leads, the trail grew colder each week. Sometimes people would call in with tips: a stranger seen near the edge of the woods, a shadowy figure walking by the old schoolhouse, the sound of children's laughter drifting across the fields at dusk. Each report was checked and double-checked, but every time it led nowhere. The Johnsons had always been private people, but now their quiet ways made them targets for rumors. Some folks thought maybe the children had run away, though no one could explain why 5 kids would leave together in the middle of the night. Others wondered if someone close to the family knew more than they were saying. It hurt Martha and George to hear these things, but they kept hoping that the truth would come out someday, and that someone, somewhere, would bring their children home. Over the years, The farmhouse itself became a sort of symbol for the mystery. Its paint peeled and its garden grew wild, but it was never empty. Martha and George refused to move, holding on to hope in their own quiet way. Every birthday, Martha baked a cake for each child, setting 5 plates at the kitchen table, just as she used to. She kept their shoes by the back door and their jackets on the hooks, just in case. Sometimes, on cold nights, she would sit in their rooms, holding their favorite toys, whispering that she loved them, hoping that somehow her words would find them. George handled his grief differently. He fixed the old tractor, repaired fences, and mended the roof. He didn't speak much about his feelings, but every morning before sunrise, he would walk the fields, searching for anything out of place. Sometimes he followed deer tracks or wandered through the woods for hours, calling the children's names softly, just in case they could hear him. The dog, Rusty, always went with him, wagging his tail and sniffing at the earth as if he, too, was still searching for his young friends. With time, people stopped coming by as often. The town continued on, babies were born, children grew up, and new families moved into empty houses. The Johnson mystery became a tale that parents told their children, a warning to stay close to home or not wander off after dark. Dared each other to visit the farmhouse at night, telling stories of ghosts and strange noises. But for Martha and George, it was just home, a place waiting for laughter to return. Every few years, the story would pop back up in the news, especially when another child went missing in a different part of the country. Sometimes a reporter would visit, asking the same old questions. Martha would show them the children's room, hoping that someone might notice a detail that everyone else had missed. A few detectives who had worked on the case in 1989 would write letters or stop by to see if the Johnsons had remembered anything new. But the answer was always the same: no clues, no evidence, no sign of the children. In 1999, it's 10 years after the disappearance, a true crime writer published a book about unsolved mysteries in small towns. One chapter was about the Johnson children. The book brought a little more attention, and for a few weeks, the phone rang, with people claiming to have seen the children in distant states. The authorities checked every lead, but none turned out to be true. Still, the book brought the case to the attention of amateur detectives and online forums. Over time, a group of people who cared about unsolved mysteries started collecting information about the case, trading theories and hoping to find the missing piece. Martha sometimes read the letters and emails that came from people she'd never met. Some sent kind words and prayers, others sent drawings or poems inspired by the missing children. There were letters from other families who had lost loved ones and wanted to offer comfort. It helped a little to know that people still cared. Even after so many years, as the new century began, the farmhouse changed again. George built a small memorial in the yard, planting 5 oak trees, one for each child. He put a bench nearby, and sometimes Martha would sit there for hours, watching the sun rise and set over the fields. The trees grew slowly, but every spring, they grew a little taller and a little stronger, just as she imagined her children would have. Some years, Martha would find small toys or trinkets left near the trees, teeny gestures from neighbors or strangers passing through, a sign that the world hadn't forgotten. The family story became woven into the town's identity, and even those who had never met the Johnson children felt a sense of loss. On the 30th anniversary of the disappearance, in 2019, a local newspaper decided to run a story remembering the case. The young reporter who wrote it had grown up hearing the tale, but wanted to do something more than just repeat the same facts. She visited the farmhouse, talked with Martha and George, and wrote a thoughtful piece that told not just of loss, but of hope and resilience. She included photos of the children, the farmhouse, and the oak trees, along with interviews from neighbors, retired police officers, and even one of the original searchers, who is now in his 70s. The article touched many people in the town and beyond. People sent flowers, cards, and messages of support. Some shared new theories and ideas, while others simply wanted to let the Johnsons know they hadn't been forgotten. For a little while, it brought a gentle warmth to the farmhouse again. a reminder that kindness still existed in the world. Despite everything, Martha and George never gave up hope. In their hearts, they believed that the truth would come out someday and that their children's story would finally be known. They kept the porch light on every night, just in case someone found their way home. And as the years went by, the mystery of the 5 vanished children remained quiet and unsolved, but never forgotten by those who cared. The farmhouse stood, strong against the passing seasons, its walls holding memories of laughter and love, as well as sorrow. In every room, there was a sense of waiting, not just for answers, but for the return of joy. The story of the Johnson family, woven into the life of the town, became a gentle lesson in hope and patience, a reminder that some mysteries are never truly lost, and that sometimes all a family can do is hold on to love and keep believing in miracles. The years kept passing, as quietly as the wind that moved through the fields around the old Johnson farmhouse. For Martha and George, the pain of not knowing never truly left, but life had found a gentle, steady rhythm. The 5 oak trees in their yard grew strong, their branches reaching upward, just as the hope inside the Johnsons never faded away. Even so, with every new year, it felt less likely that anyone would ever find out what really happened to their 5 children. The world was changing. Technology was making new things possible, and stories that had once faded into the background were being looked at in fresh ways. In the spring of 2024, something unexpected happened. The FBI, as part of a new effort to solve old cases, decided to revisit the story of the vanished Johnson children. They brought new tools, computers that could scan and organize thousands of pages of notes, and scientists who could examine tiny pieces of evidence that older machines had missed. At first, Martha and George did not know about the renewed interest in the case. Their days continued as usual. Martha made breakfast, tended to her garden, and wrote letters to distant cousins. George fixed the fence that kept breaking and made sure the barn was tidy. But one afternoon, a letter arrived in their mailbox with the official FBI seal. The agent who signed it, Agent Rachel Collins, explained that she and her team wanted to speak to the Johnsons again, see if there was anything, no matter how small, that might help. Martha's hands trembled as she read the letter. Years she had hoped for news, but now that it had arrived, it felt almost too heavy to bear. She and George agreed to meet with the agent the following week. When Agent Collins arrived, she was kind and respectful, listening carefully to the Johnsons as they shared old memories. She didn't ask the same questions as everyone else. Instead, she wanted to know about the children's personalities, their habits, and even their favorite hiding spots. Meanwhile, the FBI team in the city began working through all the files from the original investigation. There were boxes and boxes of old papers, handwritten notes, photographs, and taped interviews. Using new computer programs, they were able to look for connections and clues that might have been missed all those years ago. One agent, named Mark, noticed an envelope marked Anonymous Letter -1989. Inside was a short note that had been found in the farmhouse mailbox a week. After the children vanished, the handwriting was shaky, and there was no return address. At the time, investigators believed it was just a prank. But now, with new technology, the team wondered if there might be more to it. The note read, "You look in the wrong places. They are far, but not gone." At first glance, it did not say much, but Mark noticed that the paper itself had an unusual watermark. When he searched for other letters in the area with the same watermark, he found that it had been used by a local handyman who moved from town to town, taking odd jobs in rural areas. The handyman's name was Martin Kelly, and he had once fixed the Johnsons' fence just a month before the children disappeared. With this information, the team began looking into Martin Kelly's old addresses, work records, and even searching for anyone who might remember him. They discovered that Kelly had moved to a neighboring state just weeks after the Johnson children went missing. Old police records showed that he had also been in 2 other towns where unusual things had happened around the same time. The evidence was not solid, but it was enough for Agent Collins to feel that they needed to learn more. During another visit to the Johnson farmhouse, Agent Collins asked Martha and George if they remembered the handyman. Martha recalled that Kelly was quiet and polite, but had seemed lonely. He had a limp and always wore a hat, even in the summer. Heat. She also remembered that he had given Jenny, one of the twins, a small carved wooden bird as a thank you for bringing him lemonade one afternoon. That bird had disappeared along with the children. Agent Collins asked if the Johnsons had ever noticed anything else unusual before the children went missing. Martha paused, thinking hard. She remembered that a few days before she had found muddy footprints near the back door, early in the morning. She thought they were from one of the kids, or perhaps the dog, but now she wondered if it could have been someone else. Back at the FBI office, the team brought in a fingerprint expert to examine the anonymous letter again. Old records from 1989 had listed a partial fingerprint, but there was no match in the databases back then. Now, with improved technology, they scanned the print once more. This time, they got a possible match. It was Martin Kelly's. Excitement buzzed through the team, but they were careful not to jump to conclusions. Agent Collins and Mark traveled to the town where Kelly had last been seen. He had passed away several years before, but they managed to speak to people who had known him. One woman, who had worked at the local post office, remembered that Kelly used to keep to himself, but sometimes talked about helping families in need. She also recalled seeing a group of children at his property one afternoon, but she assumed they were just visitors. With this new information, Agent Collins ordered a search of Kelly's last property, a small, rundown house on a remote piece of land. Using ground-penetrating radar, the search team discovered an old shed behind the house. The shed was locked tight and covered in vines. Inside, they found a few children's toys, including a faded wooden bird that Martha later identified as Jenny's. There were also a few pieces of clothing and an old backpack with Emily's initials stitched on the strap. The discovery made headlines, and the story quickly spread across the country. Reporters and news crews arrived at the Johnson farmhouse, eager to hear from Martha and George. The FBI was careful not to give away too much information, but they confirmed that they were closer than ever to finding out what had happened. For the Johnsons, the news brought a confusing mix of hope and fear. They wanted answers, but they were scared of what those answers might be. Every phone call made Martha's heart race, and every knock at the door made George's hand shake. Still, they knew they had to be brave, not just for themselves, but for the children they still loved so much. In the weeks that followed, the FBI dug deeper into the shed and the surrounding land. They found evidence that suggested the children had been there, but what happened next was still a mystery. There were signs that someone had cared for them. There were blankets, food wrappers, and even old school books with Emily's name written inside. But the children themselves were not found. As the country watched the story unfold, people everywhere hoped for a miracle. The Johnsons waited at their farmhouse, holding on to each other and praying that the truth would finally come to light. They were surrounded by memories, and by the gentle strength of their love that had lasted through decades of not knowing. And that would carry them through whatever happened next. The investigation had opened a door that had been shut for decades. And now, the world watched closely as the story moved forward. The FBI's work at the remote property where Martin Kelly had once lived was careful and quiet at first. They wanted to be sure of everything before speaking out. The small shed behind the house, which had been hidden by vines in time, became the center of the search. Agents worked with forensic experts, archaeologists, and local law officers to examine every inch of the property. The sun rose and set over the fields as people dug, uncovered, and pieced together what had once been lost. Inside the shed, they had already found the wooden bird and a backpack with Emily's initials. That was the beginning. As days went by, the excavation grew deeper. The agents used gentle tools so they would not damage anything that could help explain the story. They uncovered a small hidden space beneath the floorboards. The space had been covered carefully years ago, almost as if someone did not want it found. When the floor lifted, they saw signs that it had once been used to store things: 5 small blankets, each folded and placed with care, though now faded and worn by time. The patterns on those blankets matched the ones that the Johnson children had used. There were also simple toys, a small wooden puzzle with pieces missing, and a worn-out storybook with drawings on its pages in a child's handwriting. Nearby, in a place that had been shielded from light and curious eyes, agents found a notebook. The cover was torn, but the pages inside had careful, trembling handwriting. It was not a journal in the way people usually thought of it. It was a series of notes written over time. The notes spoke of the children's routines, when they needed help, what they liked to eat, how they laughed, and even the way Emily once sang softly to calm Jenny when she was scared. Someone had watched them closely. The handwriting was not perfect, but it showed care. It said things like, "They need safety. I promise I will not let the bad thing happen again, and I will tell them stories so they still feel like home." The notebook confused the agents. It did not match what the team expected. It showed someone who had spent time with the children, someone who had tried to protect them in their own way. Yet there were pieces missing, and questions that had not been answered. Careful analysis of the paper and ink placed the notes in the months after the disappearance. That meant the children had been somewhere safe here, at least for a while. But then something had changed. The search widened beyond the shed. The agents used more advanced tools to map the surrounding woods and small fields near the property. They found a shallow area not far from the house, where the ground looked disturbed in a pattern that had been hidden by leaves and earth over time. In that ground, they uncovered small, carefully hidden containers, old metal boxes wrapped in cloth. Inside the boxes were things that showed the children had been leaving messages without words. One box had a small stone with 5 tiny scratches on it. Another had a folded scrap of cloth with the smell of the Johnson farmhouse still faintly present, like a ghost of the life they once had. The most startling find was deeper, near a set of roots from a large tree. There, hidden under a layer of dirt and covered with a thin cloth, the agents found a small bundle. When they opened it, they realized the bundle was a collection of items that belonged to the children in a way that made the heart ache. A single shoe from Jacob, a hair ribbon from Jenny, a small carved whistle that Matthew had made from a piece of wood, and a simple bracelet with beads Lily had once been proud of. Each item was clean and placed as if someone had arranged them with love before hiding them. Items did not smell like decay or fear. Instead, they gave a quiet feeling of memory, like someone had preserved these things to remember the children by, not to hurt them. The discovery set off a storm of questions. The agents took the items to labs hundreds of miles away for careful testing. DNA was compared against samples the Johnson family had agreed to give. The tests showed something that no one was ready for. The items were the children's, and there was no sign of harm in the remains of those objects. It raised more questions than it answered. If the children had been here, why were they not with these things? Where had they gone? Had they left by choice, or had someone taken them again? The notebook's promise of safety hung in the air like a half-finished sentence. The news broke slowly, because the FBI wanted the facts right. When the public learned what had been found, the country was stunned. Reporters spoke quietly outside the farmhouse, people in other towns followed the story, and the Johnsons sat in their kitchen watching the television in silence. Martha held a folded piece of paper that the agent had given her. It had a photograph of the wooden bird, the bracelet, and other small treasures. Her hands trembled, and she looked at George with eyes that held both fear and something like hope. George did not say much. He kept staring out the window toward the fields, remembering the sounds of children playing there years ago. Agent Collins arranged for a private meeting. She wanted the Johnsons to hear the truth with care, even if the truth was incomplete. She explained what had been found, how the children's belongings had been arranged, and about the notebook's strange, gentle messages. She did not give them answers about where the children were now, because she did not have them. She said they had been here, and that someone had tried to keep them safe from something that the notebook did not fully name. The country watched as the details came out. People sent letters again. The small oak trees in the yard were now visited daily by those who wanted to leave flowers, notes, and small mementos of their own. The farmhouse, once quiet, filled again with voices. Some came hoping to help. Others came out of simple curiosity, drawn like moths to the light of mystery being opened. The notebook itself became an object of careful study. Experts in handwriting, psychology, and history read the pages again and again. They believed the person who wrote the notes had been through something hard. He or she had not been cruel, and the tone shifted between fear and hope. The name of the writer did not appear, but clues were hidden in the way the words were written. In the choice of certain phrases that matched things the Johnson children had said in there, original interviews from 1989 that made the team believe. The writer had spent days with the children, learning small details that only someone close to them could know. At the same time, a new witness came forward. A woman who was a teenager in 1989 had seen a man walking near the Johnson property around the time the children vanished. She had not spoken up before because she had been afraid, but the recent attention gave her strength. She remembered that. The man carried a large bag and moved slowly, as if he didn't want to be seen. Her memory was not perfect, but when she looked at a photograph of Martin Kelly, she nodded, saying he was the one she had seen. That memory helped fill a gap, connecting the person who might have taken the children with the place where they had later been kept. The agents now had a complicated picture. The 5 children were taken from their home, kept somewhere hidden, and then placed with care in the remote property after some time. Someone had tried to protect them, wrote promises and notes, and left their belongings in special places so that if they ever disappeared again, someone could find proof that they had existed and been cared for. The question of what happened next remained heavy and unkindly silent. The story had moved from mystery into something more layered, like layers of paint on an old wall, each one adding history but hiding what was beneath. The discovery became a turning point. The world no longer saw the Johnson case as only a sad memory from a faraway farm. It became a belief shared by many that truth, even after decades, could still be found. People wished for the missing piece, the part that would explain why the children were gone and where they had gone. For Martha and George, the discovery was a mix of relief and pain. They had proof their children had been kept safe in some way, and proof that someone had known them, spoken kindly to them, and tried to protect them. The pain was in the silence after that care, in the missing years where nothing was known. As Part 4 closed, the story held its breath. The world waited quietly with the Johnsons, looking for the next step, hoping for explanation, and feeling the weight of what had been found. The discovery had stunned the country, but the real answer, the part that would bring full closure, was still hidden just beyond reach. The discovery had changed everything and yet left so much unsaid. The Johnsons now had proof that their children had been somewhere, that someone had cared enough to give them blankets and toys, to write notes promising safety, and to keep their things safe enough so those items could be found years later. That knowledge settled over Martha and George like both a shelter and a weight. They had questions that shouted in their minds, but also a quiet place inside where they felt, for the first time in decades, that their children had not been forgotten by the world or by the people who had held them, even if only for a while. The days after the news were a blur. Farmhouse, which had been mostly quiet for 35 years, now had a steady flow of people coming and going. Some were there to offer help. Some came to leave flowers and small notes at the base of the oak trees. Others simply stared from a distance, wanting to witness the place where part of the truth had been revealed. The Johnsons accepted the support of those who were gentle. They declined the spotlight of cameras that wanted raw emotion for the sake of headlines. Agent Collins and her team worked to protect them from too much noise while they kept searching. For what came next, the country watched as experts tried to piece together the rest of the story. There were new interviews. Old witnesses were rechecked. The man who had written the notebook, the person who had shown care and worry in shaky handwriting, still had no name attached. But the notebook became a kind of bridge between the vanished years and the present. People tried to understand the person's choices. Had they taken the children to keep them safe from someone worse? Had they believed danger was coming and hidden the children? Or had they been trying to help while feeling powerless against events they could not control? Every theory carried emotion, and many people wrote letters sharing their own ideas, their own experiences with protection and fear. As the investigation continued, the story of the Johnson children spread beyond the news. It became a conversation. On radio shows, in quiet living rooms, and in classrooms, teaching about missing children and how communities could support families. Story mattered because it showed how a small town, long after a tragedy, could keep hope alive for a family that had been waiting. It also showed how new tools and new people who did not forget could bring light into dark corners that time had hidden. The FBI did not stop at the discovery. They began connecting the timeline of what had been learned. They looked for the places the children might have been in the years between their disappearance from the farmhouse and their presence at Martin Kelly's old property. One thing became clearer. The children had been moved more than once. Their belongings had been kept safe and hidden with care, but somewhere along the way, the hidden shelter had ended, and they had been shifted again. That truth made experts feel both close and far away from the full answer. It meant the trail had continued after the notebooks. Someone had taken responsibility, again, for their safety, in a way that made finding them harder. Martha and George tried to live in the days that remained. They went outside to tend their small garden, spoke with neighbors who brought casseroles, and took quiet walks together under the shade of the oaks. When the sun was low, they would sit on the porch holding each other's hands, watching shadows grow across the yard where their children once ran. Rusty, older now and slower, still followed George from place to place, his soft eyes always carrying a gentle reminder of the past. The parents spoke more openly, sometimes sharing memories that they had kept inside for years. George would talk about the sound of Emily singing, the way Matthew had drawn little animals with too many legs because he had wanted them to be special, how Jacob and Jenny would finish each other's sentences, and how Lily would clap when she was happy. They also talked about the future. They knew the story might never fully end in the way they wanted. They understood that perhaps some pieces would remain missing forever, but the discovery gave them something they had waited for: proof that someone had taken care of their children, and that their children had been real, loved, and remembered. That opened a space inside them where they could begin to heal, not by forgetting the pain, but by holding both the pain and the proof together, like two sides of the same picture. The town responded in its own quiet and meaningful ways. People who had once whispered now openly offered support. The local school organized a day where students planted flowers near the oak trees and wrote short notes on small paper leaves to hang from branches, messages of hope and memory. The church held a service to honor the memory of missing children and to celebrate the strength of families who kept loving in uncertainty. Even those who had once believed the case was impossible began to help with small tasks. Someone fixed the broken fence near the entrance to the property. Another person brought fresh bread every week, and others offered to help Martha with letters, so she would not have to write alone anymore. The discovery also brought other families forward. Some had seen the pieces of the story and felt brave enough to share something they had hidden. Small fragments of information came from people who, for years, had held secrets out of fear or shame. The investigation team listened without judgment. The new information did not immediately complete the story, but it added texture and depth to what was known. Short memories of a strange car passing, a person who had seemed nervous near the edge of town, someone who had once heard children playing in a place thought empty. Each piece did not solve the mystery fully, but it made the full picture feel less like a gap and more like a puzzle that many hands had tried to help complete. The national conversation began to change too. Journalists who had followed the story pointed out how the case showed the importance of never forgetting a missing child. They spoke about how time does not erase the truth if people keep watching, listening, and caring. The Johnsons were careful not to let their story become too loud or used in ways that took away their privacy, but they agreed to speak once, enough so others would understand that hope could survive long years, that those who loved missing people still needed a voice. In the months after the discovery, the FBI called a public meeting. They shared what they could: the safe place where the children had been, the mystery of the notebook, the moving of the children, the fact that their belongings had been found with care. They asked the public for more help. They needed more memories, no matter how small, and they asked for patience as they continued to search. The Johnsons attended quietly, standing at the back of the room as the agents spoke. Martha had a small smile when she saw the crowd, and George gently squeezed her hand, letting the presence of others feel like support, not pressure. One evening, a small package arrived for Martha. Inside was a ribbon, faded but familiar. Was the same ribbon Jenny had worn in her hair when she was 7. Martha held it close, feeling the thin fabric, and thought of the notebooks, the blankets, and the loving care shown by an unknown person. She whispered a thank you into the quiet house for the care someone had once taken, and for the strength that had kept her family going. She placed the ribbon on the small shelf above the fireplace, right next to a photo of the children taken years before. When their smiles were wide and the sun had lit their faces, the spring after the discovery, the oak trees bloomed brighter than before. People said it was a sign that even after so many years, roots had gone deep and life was still growing. Martha and George visited the trees every day, leaving small notes tucked under the stones at their base. They no longer waited for a door to open. Instead, they made room in their hearts for what they had, and held hope carefully for what could still come. The case did not end there. The investigation carried on, guided by the new evidence and by the quiet faith of a family that would never give up looking for truth. The country still watched. A story had changed from being just a mystery to being a story about memory, care, and the slow strength of love waiting for answers. People who had once felt powerless now felt connected, like they were part of a long effort to bring light into the last corners of the story, in the Johnson farmhouse. The light in the kitchen still turned on each morning. Martha made tea, and George checked the gate. They lived simply, but with a kind of peace that had not been there before. It was not the peace of forgetting. It was the peace that comes when a wound is still healing, but the pain is not carrying the whole weight of a person anymore. The missing piece was still somewhere, and the hope for it stayed, quiet but firm. Like the roots of the oaks growing deeper every day, the story of the 5 children, vanished long ago, had finally brought the country to a place where a family could feel heard and a mystery could breathe again. It would take time for everything to become clear. There would be more questions, perhaps more answers, and maybe eventually a final chapter where the truth would come fully into light. Until then, Martha and George held on to each other, to the memories and to the belief that love, once started, never really ends.